Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Did Shakespeare. I'm Cassidy Cash. This month of September, we are taking a look at all the different kinds of weapons in Shakespeare's England, or I guess most specifically, we're taking on one each week for the month of September. And today is the last one in our series. So if you haven't seen the halberd and the other weapons that we've looked at for the month of September, go back in the feed and check those out because it's been really fun. But this week, we're rounding things out by taking a look at a really fun, not necessarily weapon from Shakespeare's plays, and that is the gauntlet. And we're going to ask, did Shakespeare use a gauntlet? Okay, so it's kind of a tricky question, right? Because when I think of the word gauntlet, I think of running the gauntlet, which is an expression we still have today in the 21st century. And that's this idea of just one thing after another, you're running the gauntlet. Like if you have a lot of, for example, we're in the process of moving. And so if you just have like big project after big project after big project to get something done, we use that colloquially to mean you are running the gauntlet. You're having to go through a lot of things. Well, running the gauntlet was actually in existence in the 16th century, in the early 16th century, like 1525. I think technically that counts as the middle, but work with me. Early middle, whatever. I found an engraving of someone running the gauntlet. Now, the engraving was done by a Swiss German artist, and actually, the phrase "running the gauntlet" it's originated in Sweden. So, etymologically, linguistically, the history of the word. According to the history of the phrase running the gauntlet, it actually didn't get to England until after Shakespeare's lifetime. In the 17th century is when that phrase came to England. So while they might have been using this version of a military punishment, it turns out there's way less French history associated with the gauntlet than I had hoped, because I like all things French. But what it actually turns out to be for William Shakespeare's lifetime is a gauntlet was a glove. I know, right? I was surprised to discover this too. But apparently, it's the metal gloves that you see as part of armor, which makes sense because if you're fighting, especially with swords and hand to hand combat, you don't want to lose your fingers. So they have metal armor plated gloves. Now, in the 1500s, this looked like a mitten. You know, if you think about mittens that you wear that fit over your hands and they cover all of your fingers at once, except it was metal. And so you could like do like this, but there wasn't really a whole lot of dexterity in your fingers. By Shakespeare's lifetime, by the 16th century and into the 1600s, they developed this a lot better. And so it literally looked like a metal glove. Each one of the fingers had its own place to be, and the metal was jointed so the finger could move. And that's what you'll see show up in Shakespeare's plays. For example, in Henry IV, Part 2, one of the references to gauntlet says, "A scaly gauntlet now with joints of steel must glove his hand." That is the best reference in Shakespeare that I found that describes what a gauntlet is, because it did have joints of steel and it was a glove over the hand. But the gauntlet also shows up in other places in Shakespeare's plays. Like in Hamlet, the stage directions from Act 5 say, "Attendants enter with foils and gauntlets." Now, this scene, Act 5 in Hamlet, is at the end when Hamlet is finally going to duel Laertes, and the attendants are basically coming in and setting the stage. It's very formal, it's very royal court kind of thing going on. You must do this, the way. And that the foils are actually the swords that they're going to be fighting with, and the gauntlets were these gloves. Taking a look at the history behind these metal gloves. The gloves were not just useful in battle as a military armor piece. They were also a universal call to arms. They were seen as, if you were to take your metal glove and throw it on the ground, you were declaring for anyone that saw you do this that you were challenging that person to a fight. You were declaring war. And it's kind of a holdover from medieval history, but you can see this show up in Shakespeare's plays. In Henry IV, Part 3, the stage directions tell the actor to throw down his gauntlet. And that's done because the person who throws down the gauntlet is the Marquess of Montague, also known as Sir John in this Sir John Montgomery. So he's got two names, so don't let that confuse you. It's the same dude. And he is challenging anyone there to a fight. And you see him say that in the line when he says, "And whosoever gainsays King Edward's right, by this I challenge him to a single fight." Interestingly, the idea of throwing down one's glove as a challenge or a declaration of a fight has persisted into the 20th and 21st century, appearing in several films. And I found one Warner Brothers cartoon of Bugs Bunny where he and Yosemite Sam are fighting, and Sam declares war on Bugs Bunny by slapping him with a glove. I'll link to that in today's show notes because it's relevant to the Shakespeare's lifetime and actually predating Shakespeare. The idea of having your glove be a symbol for war comes from this time period. So I'll link to that in the show notes. But to understand what's happening in this scene, you need to understand a little bit about it, what it meant to be a marquis. Now, a marquis was a nobleman of hereditary rank. They were born into this position based on the land that they owned. They were not as high ranking as a duke, but they were higher than an earl. So they were in between a duke and an earl. Now, the marquis usually had borderlands. So part of the marquis's job was to defend the country because their lands were usually on the edge where an invasion would begin. Now, just because their job was to defend the country, though, doesn't mean that they walked around dressed in full armor all the time. In fact, they had a very precise outfit that they had to wear. And in England today, the marquis still has this very particular costume they're supposed to wear. I'll link you to that in the show notes as well, because you can see Prince Andrew is dressed up as a marquis, and he has an official role in that way. And so I'll show you some modern examples of how this tradition continues. But the point is, he didn't walk around dressed in armor. So in this scene, Shakespeare makes a point in the earlier dialogue to let you know that he's dressed in armor, and that's how he has this glove to throw down. So the stage directions don't have to have an attendant bring him the gauntlet the way it happens in Hamlet. You know, Hamlet wasn't dressed in full armor, so someone had to bring him the declaration of war so he could throw it down. In this scene, the marquis already has it on, and you can see that because King Edward IV welcomes him and says, "Hello." Well, he doesn't say hello. He says, "Welcome, Sir John, but why come you in arms?" That line lets you know that when he enters the scene, he is dressed in full armor, and that that's not necessarily normal for the marquis. But it is why the marquis can throw down the gauntlet without needing it to be brought in for him. So they were, as they are described in Henry IV, Part 2, both scaly and having joints of steel. And during the 16th century, they were developed far enough to be very dexterous, and they were a big improvement over what was going on in the earlier versions. One historian described the gauntlet as, by the 16th century, when someone threw down the gauntlet, there was no denying the significance of the act. More than just protective armor, the gauntlet was literally regarded as the hand of war. So for Shakespeare and the references in his plays, the gauntlet was a military glove with an actual purpose as a piece of armor, but it was most often used as a symbol. And you can contextualize this in your mind as the idea, now, this is the antithesis of war, right? We're not declaring war with a white flag, but you can understand the concept of it actually being a thing and also being more than a thing and being a symbol for something else. That's what the gauntlet served as. It was an actual thing that was used, but it served as a much bigger symbol and a declaration of war. It was something that they used as a symbol to declare somebody's intention to fight. In the show notes for today's episode, I have all the resources that I used to put together this week's episode. And that includes pictures of, there are nobles appearing before Richard II, and you can see all of their gloves there on the floor, and they are asking for war. And there's several other links to what these gloves looked like, and more history, and certainly links to all the sources that I used to put this episode together for you. So if you want to explore further, since I can't cram centuries of information into one video, I suggest that you explore this further by checking out the show notes at castacast.com/gauntlet. That's it for this week. I'll see you guys next week. Thank you for watching, and I hope you learned something new about the Bard. Bye-bye.